For the next 20 seconds, imagine you're sitting alone in a dark room. You hear something creak behind you, but when you turn, there's nothing there. Your heart pounds. The shadows in the corner shift. And in those fleeting seconds, you feel a chill so deep that it crawls under your skin. By the time you look away, you realize this story has already begun, and there's no going back. Share your thoughts and comments. Tell me about your own spooky encounters, or suggest what you'd like to hear next. Now, let's begin the tale. I was only 14 the first time I heard of the creepypasta that everyone claimed gave them nightmares. In my small town, dark rumors travel fast. Kids love to scare each other with ghost stories and urban legends. But this particular story was different. It was whispered about in hushed tones during lunch breaks, passed around in scribbled notes folded neatly into pockets, and typed up anonymously on late-night forums where the digital glow of the screen was the only source of comfort. Even though most people treated it like a regular scary story, I noticed there was always a strange look in their eyes when they talked about it. It was as if they felt a genuine fear that stretched beyond the usual fun of a campfire tale. None of them wanted to admit how unsettled they really were, but I could sense it in their trembling voices, in the way they would bite their lips or glance over their shoulders whenever they brought it up. My best friend, Kelly, was the first person to tell me I absolutely had to read it. We were sitting in her bedroom one evening, the light from the setting sun creeping through her pink curtains, turning the room into a canvas of warm and fading gold. She was on her laptop, reading something with an intense look on her face, her knees pulled to her chest. She didn't notice I was studying her until a slow gasp slipped out of her mouth. I asked her what was wrong. She jumped, quickly closed the laptop, and stared at me with wide eyes. Nothing, she said at first, but then she hesitated. It's just a creepy story. Of course, that made me even more curious. But she refused to tell me much. She only whispered a warning. Once you read it, it follows you. It crawls into your head. It makes you see things when you sleep. When I laughed at her, thinking it was all a silly rumor, she grabbed my arm and her nails dug in deeper than I expected. I'm serious, she insisted, eyes blazing. People say it's cursed. Back then, the idea of a cursed story sounded both thrilling and ridiculous. I had spent many nights reading ghost stories online, searching for something genuinely terrifying. Usually, I was disappointed by shallow jump scares or predictable endings. But the way Kelly trembled, the way her face had turned pale and her eyes darted to the windows, made my stomach twist. She whispered that this story had no official title, just references to a hidden thread in a forgotten forum. It was rumored to appear only when the reader felt a certain type of despair, or during a fleeting hour of the night when sleep was impossible. It supposedly found you if you were unlucky enough. The story was about a faceless woman, or so the rumor said. Anyone who read it would dream of her. She would come to them in the darkness, creeping closer each night until her cold fingers brushed across their cheeks. Then, she would whisper secrets about the future, dark secrets about nightmares that would one day come true. Some folks tried to save others from reading it, urging them to stay away. Yet ironically, their warnings only fueled more curiosity. Months passed, and the story remained an urban legend in my mind. Until one humid, suffocating summer night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself scrolling through random forums, corners of the internet that I had never explored before. I clicked link after link, each leading to a place stranger than the last. Eventually, I stumbled upon a message board that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. There was a single post at the top with no subject line and no identifiable username. My heart thumped in my chest because something about that blank post drew me in, like a silent invitation. Despite a faint sense of dread pulsing in the back of my mind, I clicked on it. The screen flashed, then showed me a single block of text. I was about to read it when a storm outside rattled my window, making me jump. The words on the screen blurred as lightning flashed, painting the walls of my room in stark white. Taking a deep breath, I finally began reading. It started innocently enough. describing a lonely house at the edge of a forest and a figure wandering through its silent halls at night. The writing was so plain, so matter-of-fact, that I almost found it boring at first. But as I read on, my pulse began to flutter. There was something subtly unnatural about the descriptions, a quiet horror that sneaked up on me. It described how the figure had no face, how it drifted noiselessly across the creaking floorboards, how it slid beneath the door of a child's bedroom like a creeping shadow. My eyes scanned the words, and each sentence seemed to bore deeper into my mind, like a whisper I couldn't shake off.
I reached a line that said, "When you close your eyes, I will be right behind them." My body shivered. I glanced around my room, half expecting to see something out of place. The text continued to describe horrifying details. The figure would watch from the darkest corner, creeping closer each night. Then, at the end, it addressed me directly. "You, who have read this far, have welcomed me in. I will linger at the edge of your sight. I will pull at the edges of your dreams. You may forget me by day, but I promise you will remember me at night." My mouth felt dry. I realized my heart was pounding so loud, I could hear it thumping in my ears. I quickly tried to scroll away, but the text froze. The website locked my screen, and a small message appeared at the bottom, blinking. It read, "It's too late." I slammed my laptop shut with shaking hands. That night, I didn't sleep well. When I finally drifted off, I dreamt of a hallway. It was endless and unlit. My bare feet made no sound against the floor. The air smelled stale, like an abandoned house. A pale shape stood at the far end, and I couldn't see its face. Even in my dream, I felt a sense of dread pressing down on my chest. I called out, but no voice left my mouth. The figure glided toward me, but before I could see its features, I woke up drenched in sweat. My lungs felt tight, and my bedroom was bathed in the dim glow of my nightlight. I lay there, gasping for breath, my mind circling back to that dream. Was it the story, or just my imagination playing tricks on me? Determined to shake it off, I told myself it was nothing but a normal nightmare. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the story. It was lodged in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. I found myself checking every dark corner whenever I entered a room, jumping at the faintest sound. Each night, I'd dream of that same hallway. Each time, I would see the blurry figure at the end, a bit closer than the night before. On the third night, I heard it call my name, or something that sounded like a distorted, twisted version of my name. That was enough to make me avoid sleep as much as possible. I started drinking cups of coffee in the late evening. I left all the lights on in my room, hoping that would help me stay awake. But exhaustion always won in the end, and I'd drift off, only to wake up trembling. My fear reached a peak when I began to sense something following me during the day. I was getting ready for school one morning, brushing my hair in front of the mirror, when I noticed a movement behind me. It was just a flicker in the corner of my eye. When I turned, there was nothing there, but the feeling of being watched lingered. On the bus ride to school, I caught a glimpse of a faint reflection in the window, a shape that sat behind me even though the seat was empty. I jerked around, but once again, nothing. My heart was racing so fast, I could hardly focus on the day's classes. Every time a teacher called my name or a friend tapped my shoulder, I nearly jumped out of my skin. By lunchtime, I was a nervous wreck. Kelly noticed. She sat across from me in the cafeteria, picking at her food. She asked if everything was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. I knew she had read the story before me, and I wanted to ask if she was experiencing similar nightmares. But fear of sounding ridiculous kept me silent. I managed a weak smile, said I was just tired. She nodded, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes that made me think she already knew. That afternoon, after school, she cornered me by my locker. "It's the story, isn't it?" she whispered. I pretended not to understand, but she sighed. "We should talk about it." Reluctantly, I followed her to the library, where we found a quiet table at the back, hidden among tall shelves of old, dusty books. She told me she had been having nightmares too, about a faceless woman, not just a shadowy figure. The details were different from mine, but the dread was the same. A creeping presence that grew bolder every night. Neither of us knew how to stop it. At first, we considered the possibility that we were just psyching ourselves out. That reading something so disturbing had put these ideas in our heads and made us hallucinate or have nightmares. But then Kelly told me about a mutual friend, Ryan, who had read the story months ago. Ryan had started skipping school and claimed he was seeing ghosts in his bedroom. He spoke to them at night, eventually hurting himself in an attempt to get them to leave him alone. He ended up moving away, and the rumors said his parents sent him to a facility for help. The mention of Ryan's breakdown made my stomach churn. Something about this story felt terribly real. Was it cursed? Was it haunted? Or maybe it was some psychological trick that was so potent it could actually drive people over the edge. My anxiety was becoming unbearable. I was losing sleep, my grades were dropping, and I felt a constant dread. One night, as I lay in bed clutching my phone, I decided to see if I could find anyone else who had read it and survived without losing their minds. I went back to the forum, but the thread was gone. It was replaced by an error message, as if it never existed. A spark of panic lit inside me. It was as if the story had vanished, leaving no trace. Had I imagined it all? No. The nightmares were real enough. I typed frantic messages on every spooky forum I could find, describing the story in vague detail, asking if anyone had a solution. Most people just replied with jokes or told me to calm down. But one reply was different. It said, "Your fear is feeding it. If you can stop fearing it, you might break free." There was no username attached to the message. That cryptic answer was enough to give me a tiny glimmer of hope. Over the next week, I tried to suppress my fear. I listened to upbeat music, I forced positive thoughts, I prayed, I filled my evenings with video games that made me feel strong and in control. But every night, the hallway still called me. The figure crept closer. I was beginning to see something where the face should be, a swirling emptiness, like a vortex. When I stared too long, I felt dizzy, like the ground was slipping out from under me. Worse still, I began hearing a voice in my head during the day, a faint whisper that wasn't quite mine. I would be sitting in class, and I'd hear it say something like, "You left your door open," in a low, mocking tone. When I got home, I'd find my bedroom door wide open, even though I'd locked it before leaving. Kelly's experiences escalated too. She told me she started hearing tapping on her window at 3 a.m. Yet when she looked outside, there was no one. One night, she mustered the courage to go to the window right when the tapping started, only to see a pale hand vanish into the darkness. She swore it left behind a faint, greasy smudge, shaped like a crooked palm. She cried telling me the story, and I realized how powerless we both felt. We considered telling adults, but how could we explain? We considered going to a priest, but neither of us came from religious families. We were too afraid to talk to a therapist because they'd surely think we were hallucinating. We felt alone and cornered. Desperate, we decided to confront our fear head-on. One weekend, we gathered in my room, lit a circle of candles, and placed a printout of the story, which Kelly had somehow saved, in the center. Our idea was to read it out loud together, as many times as we could stand, to face the terror until it lost its power. It sounded insane, but we were grasping for anything. The first reading was terrifying. My voice quivered as I spoke each word, and Kelly's eyes darted around the room, as if expecting a shadow to leap out. By the second reading, we were both shaking uncontrollably. At the third reading, the lights flickered, even though there was no draft or interruption in the electricity. My lamp blinked once, twice, and then died. Candlelight alone illuminated the printed page. The atmosphere felt heavy, like the air was thickening. We reached the part that said, "You, who have read this far, have welcomed me in." A gust of wind whipped through my room, snuffing out several candles, even though the windows were closed. The shadows on the walls writhed. Kelly choked up, unable to keep going. I tried to stay strong, forced myself to continue. My voice cracked as I read the final line. "I will linger at the edge of your sight. I will pull at the edges of your dreams. You may forget me by day, but I promise you will remember me at night." Then, the last candle went out. We were plunged into darkness. For an agonizing moment, we couldn't see anything. My heart hammered in my chest, and I swore I heard something breathing beside us. Then the power surged back, and the lamp flickered on. Kelly clung to me. Her face was wet with tears, and I realized mine was too. We waited, but nothing else happened. No apparitions. No immediate nightmares. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the hiss of the air conditioner. Slowly, we cleaned up, trying to reassure each other that maybe we had taken a bold step. Maybe we had faced the fear. Maybe now it would leave us alone. However, that night's dream was the worst I'd ever had. The hallway was shorter, and the figure was directly in front of me. Its faceless head tilted, almost as if it was regarding me curiously. The whisper in my head grew louder. "You read the words again. You brought me closer. Why would you do that?" I tried to scream, but my lungs refused to work. I woke up gasping for air, my sheets soaked in sweat. The next day at school, Kelly was absent. I texted her, but she didn't reply. My anxiety spiked. When she finally showed up the following morning, she looked pale and fragile, like she hadn't slept at all. She mumbled that something was in her house. She could hear it dragging its nails across the walls. After that, everything spiraled. We stopped trying to fix things ourselves. We decided to find the origin of the story. We reasoned that if we knew who wrote it, maybe we could break the curse. We spent hours each night looking for any clue about its source. We found rumors. Some said it was part of an ancient text that had been adapted online. Others insisted it was created by a disturbed artist who lost his mind and disappeared. A rare few suggested it was not written by a person at all, but by something else, using the internet as a doorway. None of these led us to a solution. We discovered a small group of people on a dark web forum discussing the same story. They posted about seeing a creeping figure, or a faceless woman, or sometimes a shape-shifting entity that reflected each reader's deepest fears. They claimed that every new reading strengthened its presence, that each retelling was like feeding it more power. This terrified us. It meant that our attempt at confronting the story, by reading it multiple times, might have only made things worse. One user claimed they knew a ritual to seal it away, but the instructions were incomplete, and the user vanished from the forum shortly after posting, leaving the last step unfinished. At this point, Kelly and I were desperate. My parents were threatening to send me to therapy because I was hardly sleeping, and my eyes were ringed with dark circles. Kelly's parents thought she was going through some teenage phase. I'd catch glimpses of the figure even when I was wide awake, like it stood at the corner of the school hallway or behind the fence in my backyard. It would flicker out of sight when I looked directly at it. My dreams grew more vivid, more invasive. I would wake up with scratches on my arms or bruises I couldn't explain. Kelly once called me at 3 in the morning, crying and unable to speak coherently. I rushed to her house, sneaking in through her bedroom window. She was huddled in a corner, shaking uncontrollably, with scratch marks on her door. She insisted something had tried to come through her window, pushing it open despite the locked latch. We decided to track down the user who posted about the ritual. Their username was Nightfall. We combed through old archives, hidden message boards, anywhere we could find a trace. Finally, we stumbled upon an email address buried in a comment thread. We emailed them, begging for help. Days passed with no reply. Then, just as we were losing hope, we received a single, short message. "Meet me in the old library at midnight. Come alone." The library they mentioned was an abandoned building on the outskirts of town, scheduled for demolition. It was rumored to be haunted. Under normal circumstances, we would never go there alone, especially at midnight. But these were not normal circumstances. On a stormy Saturday night, Kelly and I snuck out of our homes. The sky rumbled with thunder as we biked to the library. The building was boarded up, its windows cracked and dusty. We found a back door that was slightly ajar, as if someone had pried it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and rotting books. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing rows of empty shelves and tattered carpets. Water dripped from the ceiling in steady intervals, echoing like a countdown. We whispered for nightfall, but only silence answered. Our footsteps echoed as we explored, hearts hammering. I was about to suggest we leave when a figure stepped out from behind a shelf. It was a woman, perhaps in her 20s, with dark, tangled hair and hollow eyes. She wore a long coat, and her face looked haunted. She spoke in a trembling voice, explaining that she was the one who left the email. She had read the story years ago. She had lost her family and her sanity. "It becomes your shadow," she said in a raspy whisper. But I have a way, a partial way. We hung on her every word. She told us about a ritual that involved burning an object that represented our deepest fear, while reciting a passage from a text older than we could imagine. She believed that if enough people did this, if they refused to share the story or feed it, the entity would weaken. But there was a catch. "The final line is missing," she said, her eyes darting nervously. "I've searched everywhere. No one knows it. Without it, the ritual is incomplete." She pulled out a crumpled piece of paper with faded words on it. The language was archaic, filled with strange symbols that made my skin crawl. Kelly and I exchanged a glance, doubt filling our minds. But we were out of options. That night, we performed the half-known ritual. We each brought something that embodied our fears. For me, it was a photo of my family, representing the terror of losing them to this curse. For Kelly, it was a small mirror, symbolizing her fear of seeing the entity's face in her reflection. We lit a fire in a rusted metal barrel the mysterious woman had dragged inside. Rain hammered the roof as we chanted the odd words under flickering flashlight beams. The flames danced, and the woman whispered instructions. Place the objects in the fire, recite the incantation, and maintain a pure intention to banish the presence. We followed her lead. I felt a swirl of dizziness, as if the room itself was tilting. Halfway through, a gust of wind tore through the library, knocking the barrel over and scattering the flames. The woman shouted for us to keep chanting. We tried, but the symbols were unfamiliar, and we stumbled over them. I felt an overwhelming surge of dread, as though something was standing right behind me, breathing cold air down my neck. My flashlight flickered, and in the brief darkness, I saw a silhouette with no face. It was so close, I could almost feel its ice-cold presence. Suddenly, the woman screamed. We turned to see her face contorted in terror. She dropped the paper and clutched her head, screaming about something grabbing her mind. We rushed to help her, but she collapsed, convulsing on the floor. Her eyes rolled back, and she whispered in a strangled voice, "It's here. It's angry." Before we could do anything, she went limp. For a moment, I thought she was dead, but then she moaned softly, as if in pain. Kelly and I were shaking so badly we could hardly speak. We tried to lift her, but she was surprisingly heavy, or maybe our fear just made us weak. The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying the smell of wet decay. We had to get out. As we stumbled toward the exit, the shadows on the walls stretched and twisted. We could hear whispering, though none of us were talking. Once outside, we lay the woman on the grass under the pounding rain. She coughed and regained consciousness, her eyes glassy. She murmured, I tried. The missing line. You have to find it." She passed out again. We carried her to our bikes, which was a struggle. In a panic, we managed to get her to a local clinic, leaving her at the doorstep anonymously, terrified of the questions that would follow if we stayed. We spent the rest of the night locked in my room, hearts pounding, waiting for something to come after us. My parents were away on a trip, so they never knew. The hours felt like days, and we jumped at every little noise. But nothing happened. When morning finally came, we heard nothing about the woman's condition on the local news. We had no clue what became of her. After that horrifying night, Kelly and I agreed we had to do something drastic. We couldn't keep living in fear. The nightmares were getting worse, and I often caught myself in a daze, hearing voices that weren't there. The sense of being watched had become constant. We decided to track down the missing line of the ritual ourselves. We found references to an old manuscript rumored to contain exorcisms and wards against malevolent forces. Supposedly, it was locked away in a private collection near our town. We had no idea how to gain access, but desperation fuels courage. We lied our way in, claiming to be doing a school project on ancient folklore. Surprisingly, the caretaker believed us, or maybe he was just too tired to question two anxious teenagers. We searched through countless dusty tomes in a cramped storeroom that smelled of old leather and time. Eventually, we found a fragile, yellowed page that contained symbols similar to what the mysterious woman had shown us. Our hearts pounded as we matched them up. Though we weren't linguists, we managed to decipher a string of words that seemed to fit. At the end of the page was a single line that looked like the missing piece. We jotted it down, our hands shaking with excitement and dread. We felt like we were on the edge of something monumental. Night fell as we crept back to my house, determined to attempt the ritual again, this time with a final line. But a new problem arose. We no longer had the original text. The woman took it with her, and we left her unconscious at the clinic. We debated whether we could do the ritual with just our memory and the new line. Our logic was shaky, but we forged ahead. Kelly insisted we should do it in my backyard, where we at least had an open space and a quick exit. Under the faint moonlight, we lit a fire pit. The air was thick and still. The suburban hush pressed in on us. We gathered two objects again. This time I brought a diary containing my dreams and nightmares, while Kelly brought the locked window latch from her room. Both items were deeply personal symbols of our fear. We recited the words we remembered, though we knew we might be missing some. Still, we forced every ounce of will into our voices. The flames danced, casting tall, flickering shadows. Then we spoke the final line we had discovered. The instant the words left our lips, a sharp chill blasted us, extinguishing the fire. The moonlight vanished behind a heavy cloud. In the darkness, we heard a rustling, like a shifting presence. We both froze, too terrified to run. Our hearts thundered in our chests, and my mind screamed that something was out there with us, in the blackness. Lightning flashed, illuminating the yard for a brief second. In that flash, we saw it. The figure stood behind Kelly, tall and crooked, faceless. My throat seized up. I couldn't scream. Then thunder roared, and darkness returned. I fumbled for a flashlight, shining it wildly, but the figure was gone. Kelly's hands were over her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. We were shaking, and it felt like the temperature dropped another 20 degrees. We chanted the final line again, in desperation. Another flash of lightning revealed something horrifying. Footprints, glowing faintly on the grass, leading away from us to the back gate. They faded before our eyes. We clung to each other for what felt like hours, waiting for the next sign of terror. But aside from the rumble of thunder moving farther away, the night was silent. Eventually, we gathered enough courage to go back inside. We stayed up all night, afraid to sleep, discussing whether we had succeeded or made things worse. When dawn broke, we risked a short rest. Exhaustion overcame us. I woke up around noon, expecting another day of dread. But to my surprise, the house felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel eyes on me. When I glanced out the window, the sunlight looked warm and inviting, not harsh or menacing. I texted Kelly, who had gone home in the early morning. She said she felt the same, like a weight had lifted. Tentatively, we hoped that the ritual worked. Days passed, then weeks. Our nightmares subsided. The faceless figure stopped haunting our dreams. We became ourselves again, slowly reclaiming our lives. We never found out what happened to the mysterious woman. We tried calling local clinics, but they had no record of anyone matching her description. She vanished as abruptly as she appeared. However, the knowledge of what we had been through left us with a deep understanding that some things can't be explained. The memory lingered in the back of our minds. Late at night, we would sometimes sense a faint echo of dread, but nothing as tangible as before. We agreed to never mention the story again. We deleted every trace of it we could find. Life returned to a fragile normal. Kelly and I drifted apart over time, partly because the whole ordeal was too overwhelming to discuss casually. We both moved to different cities for college, and the distance grew. But we never forgot. Every time I browsed the internet late at night, I felt the old anxiety stirring in my chest. Was it really over? Or was it just dormant, waiting for the right moment to come back? Years later, long after I thought I'd buried those memories, I stumbled upon a new discussion thread. It was on an obscure horror site, and the post read, "Anyone else read the story?" It gave me nightmares. My heart skipped a beat. The text they quoted sounded eerily similar to what I remembered. It was a short excerpt describing a faceless figure and a hallway. My palms began to sweat. Before I could stop myself, I clicked on the link. It led me to a blank page. But as I stared at it, new words began to appear. They formed slowly, like invisible ink revealing itself. My stomach twisted in terror. The last sentence on the page read, "We meet again." I slammed my laptop shut, my mind racing. Despite all the years that had passed, the fear came rushing back, as potent as ever. I recalled the warning from that anonymous user. Every new reading feeds it, and I had just read it again. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Kelly, the first time she'd reached out in months. It said, "Did you see that post? I think we're in trouble." A chill ran down my spine. We were older now, more experienced, but the fear felt the same. I typed back with trembling fingers. "We have to do the ritual again." That night, Kelly and I arranged a video call to discuss our plan. The sense of déjà vu was overwhelming. We decided we'd try to replicate the ritual as best we could, even though we no longer had the original text. We still remembered the final line. We agreed to do it simultaneously, even though we were hundreds of miles apart. As midnight approached, we lit our respective candles, placed our symbolic objects in the circle. This time, I used my old laptop, the one I first used to read the story, while Kelly used that cursed mirror again. We began to chant the words we could recall. At first, nothing happened. My voice felt strained, and I questioned whether it would work over a video call. But then, Kelly's screen flickered. The candle flames in her room elongated, turning a sickly green. My own candles swayed with no breeze. The corners of my vision began to darken, and that familiar dread returned, pressing on me like a weight. We reached the final line of the chant. In unison, we spoke the ancient words. My screen froze for a split second, and then I heard a cracking sound from somewhere in my apartment. The lights flickered. Kelly's video feed distorted, and for a moment, I saw not her face, but something else staring at me. A blank visage, as if Kelly had no features. I blinked, and it was gone. Kelly was back, tears in her eyes, but alive. When we finished, the room fell silent. The candles returned to their normal glow. The tension in the air slowly dissipated. Kelly and I stared at each other through the screen, unsure whether it was truly over. Then she said, "I think we did it again." We smiled shakily, relieved but wary. The real test would be what happened that night in our dreams. We promised to text each other in the morning. I slept fitfully. My dreams were scattered, but I didn't see any faceless figures or endless hallways. Kelly texted me at dawn with the same report, no nightmares. For a time, it seemed our renewed efforts had worked, but deep down, we both knew the story was still out there, floating in the digital ether, ready to trap another unsuspecting soul. That sense of doom weighed heavily on us. Out of a desire to protect others, Kelly and I decided to write a false version of the creepypasta, one that was obviously silly, with cliches and typos, so it wouldn't scare anyone. We posted it in the same forums where we had found references to the original, hoping to overshadow the real story. The idea was that if we buried the real version under enough nonsense, maybe people would be less likely to stumble upon it. We also tried to spread the word that reading it was dangerous. Some people listened. Others called us paranoid or gullible. But we kept at it, determined to keep the real text hidden, or at least reduce its power. Years turned into decades. I got a job, moved cities, and settled into a new routine. Kelly and I talked less and less. Life simply moved on. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, I'd wonder if the entity was still lurking in the back of my mind, waiting. But it never appeared again, at least not in the way it used to. The memory felt more like a scar than a fresh wound. Then one day, out of the blue, I received a phone call from an unknown number. It was Kelly's husband. He told me Kelly had passed away after a long battle with an illness she never told me about. My heart broke. He said her final request was for me to have a small wooden box she kept by her bedside. I hadn't spoken to her in so long. Guilt washed over me. I drove to their home for the funeral, a solemn event under gray skies. After everyone left, her husband handed me the wooden box. Inside, I found a single piece of paper, old and torn, with that final line from the ritual written in Kelly's neat handwriting. Beneath it, she wrote a note for me. If you're reading this, I'm gone, but you have to keep it at bay. Promise me. Tears blurred my vision. It felt like a final passing of the torch or the burden. I left the funeral with a heavy heart. I vowed I would keep my promise. Late that night, I sat alone in my living room, turning the piece of paper over in my hands. Memories flooded back. The nightmares, the shadows, the hallway. I could almost taste the old fear. But now I also felt an odd resolve. This thing had haunted me for so long. It had taken so much from Kelly and so many others. I decided then, and there I would find a definitive way to destroy it. I spent weeks searching for more references to the story. Most had vanished from the internet, overshadowed by new generations of horror. Technology had moved on, yet I knew that if it persisted, it was probably in some obscure corner of the web. Eventually, I found a cryptic comment on a message board. It mentioned a hidden domain where the original text could be found, along with instructions on how to end it once and for all. I was skeptical, but also desperate. I followed the link, diving deep into the digital underworld. After many dead ends, I arrived at a site with a plain black background, a single line of red text. Enter the hallway. My heart pounded. I clicked. The screen turned into a block of text, the same cursed story I had read all those years ago. Chills ran down my spine as I recognized the lines. Memories of fear shot through me, but this time I was determined not to give in. Beneath the text was a new paragraph, an addendum I had never seen. It read, "To seal the door, speak the truth of your greatest fear. Burn this page. Bury the ashes at midnight under bare earth. The cycle will break." It sounded almost too simple, yet a strange calm enveloped me. I printed the page, gathered my supplies, and at midnight, I stood in my backyard. With trembling hands, I lit the paper on fire. As it curled and blackened, I whispered my greatest fear. The fear of failing Kelly, the fear of letting this thing live on to hurt others. My voice cracked with emotion, tears burning hot on my cheeks. When the flames had consumed the text, I scooped the ashes into a small metal box. My heart thundered as I dug a hole in the ground with a spade, the moonlight guiding me. I placed the box in a hole, covered it with dirt, and stood there in silence. The wind was still, the night quiet. For a moment, I expected some dramatic sign. Lightning, thunder, a scream. But nothing happened. The only sound was my unsteady breathing. Slowly, I felt a sense of peace, as if a door had finally closed. I stood there until dawn, just to be sure. The next morning, I felt lighter than I had in years. My nightmares didn't return that night, nor in the nights that followed. Over time, I realized I hadn't just buried a piece of paper. I'd buried the hold it had over me. I don't know if the entity is truly gone for everyone, or if it just can't reach me anymore. But I haven't seen or sensed it since that night, and I have no intention of digging it back up. Still, I share this account as a warning. The story that once gave me nightmares might be gone for me, but it could be out there, waiting for another lonely night owl to stumble across it. If you ever hear whispers about a cursed creepypasta, if you ever see a forum post with cryptic text about a faceless figure, close it. Don't read on, because once it's in your mind, it sinks its claws deep, feeding on your fear. And if you're not careful, it might just haunt you. the way it haunted us. Then again, maybe it's just a story, until the night you feel a breath on your neck and realize something is standing behind you in the dark. Watching, waiting, ready to remind you that once you read it, you invited it in. So if you're still here reading, maybe you should check your windows and lock your doors. There are things out there we can't fully comprehend, and sometimes it only takes a few words on a screen to let them in. Now go on, turn on every light in your house, pour yourself something warm to drink, and try to forget what you've just read. Because once the lights go out, you'll remember. And you'll wonder if that faint noise down the hallway is just the house settling, or something else creeping closer. If you made it this far, let me know what you think. Share your own creepy experiences in the comments, or tell me what kind of story you want to hear next. But remember, some doors, once opened, are very hard to close. Be careful what you seek out in the darkness. Some nightmares are more than dreams. They're invitations, and sometimes, the guest that arrives is far more frightening than the story itself.